Today's presentation is on Herbert Read. The worth of a civilization or a culture is not valued in the terms of its material wealth or military power, but by the quality and achievements of its representative individuals, its philosophers, its poets and artists. The man known as Herbert Edward Read had an elven quality to him, and his staple attire was a pork pie hat and a bow tie. Those that spent time with him described an introvert of sorts. His silences were accompanied with the tentative scope of his warming eyes. Herbert Read was born December 4th, 1893, in a modest farmhouse in Mascotes, North Riding of Yorkshire, England. He died June 12th, 1968, in Stonegrave, North Riding of Yorkshire, England. This border country encompassed moors and dales that influenced Read's life of writing from childhood until the age of 74. Herbert Read's childhood memories evoke endless nights of bonfires, and day's light brought with it endless pages of his father's books. Named from his father, Herbert Read was a wheat farmer, grazed cattle, and owned watermills. It was a childhood filled with working on the farm and country life, ideal for a child. This would change when Read was 10 in 1903, when his father died and Read's idyllic life was severed from the moors of Mascotes. Read attended Crossley's School, living on the campus until the age of 15. During this time, Read retreated deeper into his books as his life changed immensely from roaming wide open spaces with a governess to stone walls and Spartanly strict conditions. Crossley's school was a split between orphanage and boarding school, and for 5 years he was forced to participate in sporting activities and to live in cramped quarters. The only benefit of this experience for Read was his introduction to structure in the literary form. These two starkly contrasting educational settings are reflected and are an influence on his personal development as an anarchist, poet, a modernist art historian, and literary art critic. His mother lived in Leeds, so Read moved there to live with her after he turned 15, and he worked picking up cash bags on foot and bringing them to and from bank branches. This job brought with it copious amounts of experiences and knowledge about the world outside of the moors and walls of Crossley's School. The people he interacted within the industrial city of Leeds were of the thrifty sort and pushed him to understand the classes of society at the time in England. All of these life events, varied and full of challenges, had one constant that would provide a haven for the young man, and that was books in the public library. Books were one constant in Herbert Read's life, and many things in life can be obtained from books, and he sought after them his entire life. At this point in his life, the knowledge from books brought about the vision of obtaining a different career. Read's aspirations ranged from psychological medicine to politics, and his search led him to a period of political awakening and the Tories. This political philosophy is based on a British version of traditional conservatism, which his father and now he would embrace. Reading the novels of Disraeli opened him up to other progressive thinking authors. This period of political examination would reflect an aristocratic feeling that would remain with Read his whole life and influence and shape his vision of anarchism. At the age of 17, Read began to write poetry and was encouraged by a Quaker tailor to experiment with the literary form of poems. William P. Read, with a passion for literature, encouraged the young poet and offered him a critical eye. He also introduced him to many English and Russian poets. There was family pressure for Herbert to be the first son to attend university. Cambridge was too expensive, but the recently founded University of Leeds was more affordable. Herbert Read wasn't the person to follow all of the traditions of ordinary academic discipline, but he extended his own form of education, self-education, in the school library. The closest he got to the University of Leeds undergraduate community was the Debate Society and Art Club. The library contained influential writings from Nietzsche, Marx, Sorel, Ruskin, Morris, and Edward Carpenter. These books influenced his personal philosophy so much that by 1917 his devotion to Nietzschean philosophy would lead him to be initiated into anarchism. He believed that anarchism was a doctrine which each man must relate to his own experience, and his experience was that of the artist. Herbert Read chose to remove himself from his studies at the University of Leeds with the outbreak of the First World War. He served with the Green Howards in France from January 1915 till the end of the war. The war brought about his Nietzschean sense of adventure and challenged his moral code. The presence of war didn't affect his decision to follow his previously set career path in literature. Herbert Read could hardly find a library when he was neck-deep in trenches, so he brought a mini-library with him. In the retreat of the Somme in 1918, Walden, in a sketchbook, kept Herbert Read in compass. Herbert Read emerged from the front line of war as a proficient writer. Writing poetry and sketching were ways for Herbert Read to seek peace and sanity during and after the war. Songs of Chaos, The Egoist, New Age, and The Guildsman are some of the poems and articles he wrote in 1915. During the First World War, Herbert Read would mature as a poet and would make his first impression on the literary world. He was accepted with ease by contemporary poets, most of them older than him. His friendships with Frank Rutter and Jacob Kramer, who were members of the Leeds Art Club community, would provide him with acceptance into the artist community in the future. These relationships and the discussions on art that were shared influenced Herbert Read's understanding of art. And in 1917, Herbert Read joined the artist group, The Futurist, which allowed him to display some of his drawings. Much like his aspiration to medicine in his earlier years, Herbert Read's friends suspected that he was temporarily unfit for the confined structure of an artist. The previously unsuccessful interests in psychological medicine gave direction to his floundering attempts at artistry. This directional force aided in the development of his structured form of art criticism. All of Herbert Read's life experiences helped him start up an avant-garde magazine with Rutter called Art and Letters. This magazine helped establish Herbert Read as a young writer and brought about the post-war literature and art revival in England. It is during this time, after the war, that Herbert Read would develop as an essayist with occasional excursions into other forms of prose. It is interesting to note that after the war he wrote 10 volumes of poetry and never lost his love for poetry his entire life. At this time, Herbert Read befriended post-war literary cultivators such as Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Wyndham Lewis, Richard Allington, Sitwell Brothers, and F.S. Flint. Herbert Read edited and wrote studies on the following artists: Paul Nash, Ben Nichols, and Henry Moore, of whom were associated with the modern British art movement. He became associated with Nash's contemporary art group, Unit 1. Henry Moore held the strongest interest for Herbert Read, since they held commonalities in the residence and artistic expression. Moore became involved with Herbert Read later in the development of the Gregory Fellowships. At this time, Herbert Read's artistic interests extended beyond British modernism to contemporary European and Scandinavian art. This started with artists Gabo and Pevsner and their artistic outlet in conservatism. Kandinsky, for his abstraction, and Keel's symbolism, all appealed to him. He was a personal friend of Picasso. Man Ray, he always was attracted to the artists that were challenging to their work, both visually, philosophically, and politically. The Dadaist movement connected with his rebellious side with artists such as Hans Harp. Simultaneously, Herbert Read promoted artists' interpretations such as Andrew Britton's expression on individuality in surrealism, much like his own anarchist beliefs. The minor scandal of the 1936 Surrealist exhibition in London was influenced by Herbert Read's essay skills, which connected Surrealism and Romanticism. In the 1930s, the Stalinist orthodox rejected the Surrealists, which were ideologically Marxist. This left Herbert Read to have sympathies with Marxists more than other anarchists. The Leninist Marxism was too authoritarian as a doctrine for Herbert Read to follow, as his true ideology was anarchism. Herbert Read's influence from Godwin, Peter Kropotkin, and Max Stirner guided him to be an anarchist. It was statements like this which led to his expulsion from the British Surrealist group. He wrote many influential works on the role of art in education, industry, and society. These included Mutations of the Phoenix, 1923, English Pottery, 1924, Stained Glass, 1926, Staffordshire Pottery Figures, 1939, Reason and Romanticism, 1926, Phases of English Poetry, 1928, The Sense of Glory, 1929. These publications helped Herbert Read compose his first volume of art criticism called The Meaning of Art, 1930. This book was followed closely by a series about contemporary art called Now, 1934, Art and Industry, 1934, and Art and Society, 1937. Essential Communism, 1935, Poetry and Anarchism, 1938, The Philosophy of Anarchism, 1940, The Politics of the Unpolitical, 1943, Existentialism, Marxism, and Anarchism, 1949, Anarchism in Order, published in the 1950s, are some of Herbert Read's politically driven pieces of writing. During this time, Herbert Read cooled down from political activity and co-founded the Institute of Contemporary Arts. Despite regarding himself as an anarchist, he accepted knighthood in 1953. This caused orthodox anarchists to ostracize Herbert Read from his lifelong belief system. T.S. Eliot helped Herbert Read get the attention of academic scholars, and he began lecturing at Cambridge for a year about Wordsworth in the 1930s. This renewed his involvement with the university in the 1950s by helping to establish the Gregory Fellowships. Forming the Distinguished Committee with his friends T.S. Eliot and Henry Moore, Herbert Read not only influenced the art of language, poetry, but also shaped the British art scene profoundly from the 1930s to the 1960s. The visual and literary aspects of art were his main devotion at this time and can be apparent in his writings, The Green Child, 1935, and his autobiographical sketch, The Innocent Eye, 1933, which was expanded on with Annuals of Innocence and Experience. In this same decade, Read wrote Poems, 1914 through 34, 35 Poems, 1940, and In Defense of Shelley, 1936. Even though Herbert Read's modesty throughout his life belittled his tireless energy and progressive thinking, his life's experiences allowed him to influence the artificial boundaries in the political and social science world of the West. This interest manifested itself in his essay, Psychoanalysis and the Critic, published in 1925. The source of his interest up to this point was in the Freud psychological concept. Freud would explore the human mind more thoroughly than any other human before him. He would influence thought, art, child-rearing, and the fields of psychoanalysis. Herbert Read would be drawn into the field of psychoanalytic theory by Freud until the 1930s. The impressive scholarship that the light of C.J. Jung's theory shed on critical problems in literature and the visual arts stimulated Herbert Read. The Swedish psychoanalyst and mythologist C.J. Jung theorized on the collective unconscious and its effects on art. These concepts differed in the nature and purpose of the libido, nature of the unconscious, and the cause of behavior. This inner fire never left Herbert Read, but his endless energy catered his own beliefs, which left him secluded from all aspects and classes at the time. In this one particular instance, Herbert Read persuaded his partners at Rutledge, King and Paul to publish and translate C.J. Jung's psychoanalytical theory. This one attempt was backed up by both his physical and psychological interests. The vision of his belief undoubtedly changed the West's interpretation of art, as well as the development of modern personality theory. The English translation of Jung's work brought Herbert Read to a personal relationship with Jung, which lasted until Jung's death. The outbreak of the Second Great World Conflict sharpened Herbert Read's inner fire, for his belief to influence this can be seen in A World Within a War, 1943, which some say exemplified some of his best poetry. That same year he became a director again, but this time it was for the industrial design. Herbert Read became deeply interested in children's artworks, and with the help of the British Council, Herbert Read traveled to collect works for an exhibit of British art that would tour Allied and neutral countries during the Second World War. The pieces that were considered too valuable to risk in the transportation across the Atlantic were replaced by children's drawings and paintings. Herbert Read, in making his collection, was unexpectedly moved by the expressive power and emotional content of some of the younger artists' work. The experience prompted his special attention to their culture value and his engagement of the theory of children's creativity with a seriousness that matched his devotion to the avant-garde. This work both changed fundamentally his own beliefs work throughout his remaining 25 years and provided art education with an underlying principle of unique attempts for expression. Key books and pamphlets from this period are Education Through Art, 1943, The Education of Freeman, 1944, Culture and Education in a World Order, 1948, The Grass Read, 1955, and Redemption of the Robot, 1966. Herbert Read proposed a method that used the concept of revolution from libertarian traditionalists like Gandhi, who believed violent insurrection was an outdated strategy and thought teachers would be the most influential worker syndicate in history. Herbert Read also suggested that every minute of the day should be immersed with aesthetic impulses. These senses symbolically convey the harmonies of nature through a child's eye of unconsciousness, and eventually seep into every stage after that until this final stage is reached, society itself. These senses symbolically convey the harmonies of nature through the unconsciousness of a child's eye, and eventually seep into every stage after that until the final stage is reached, society itself. Herbert Read even abandoned morals for a code of conduct that would nurture the child in a spontaneous search for form, artifacts, or manifestations. The code goes as followed. Number 1. For a harmonious society, children should seek integrity learned through the practice of exchange for mutual benefit. Number 2. The artist's relationship with the child should be strictly as the collaborator, not as the master. Number 3. Autonomy is a power that can only be conquered from within, and then can find scope only inside a scheme of cooperation. Number 4. The child's spontaneous egocentrism is reinforced, even when the examination system has been broken. Number 5. Reduce the idea of punishment through simple acts of reparation or simple measures of reciprocity. Number 6. Reaffirmation from Plato's understanding of morals in the concept that possessing ability is only what is thought to have been conquered by ourselves first. The next 20 years of Herbert Read's life are filled with expansive travels as a wandering teacher, giving lectures on art and literature, expanding all 5 continents. Herbert Read's convoluted inner conflict that he struggled with his whole life was between the urges of teaching and that of creating. This endless cycle would remain a battle for him until his passing at the homestead of Stonegrave in 1968, after 2 long battles with cancer. Not only did Herbert Read make numerous contributions to literature and art, but he donated a 14,000-volume library from his family in 1996 to the Heritage Lottery Fund. The content that Read passed on all had unique personal associations and numerous rarities, much like his personality. The most influential objects in his life, books, went to an archive in Canada in the 1960s, but he retained the items that meant most to him, such as the manuscript of his only novel, The Green Child.